I have a question that in some way follows up on what you just asked. I was thinking about your presentation and also Meiyi's presentation in terms of the politics of exhibitions like The Future of Us or of a design centre. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on the politics of the storytelling that happens in those kind of settings? We've talked a lot through this conference so far about the external projection of the Singapore model, but I think in creating urban models and urban myths, a lot of what's going on is also about the internal storytelling, politics, disciplinary discourses of telling the local population how they should think about the place they live and how they should think about the politics of the place they live. I wonder if you could just, respond to that, reflect on that, if that's the case.
Certainly it is telling, it is a political enterprise, right? This SG50 and the whole nostalgia and memory projects, right? And the story is that there is an uncontested history, and this is what will be allowed, right? And the uncontested histories are beyond the pale, and they ought to be censored by various ways or restricted. And Jason Su still around? Jason makes the film called Untracing the Conspiracy, which is an alternative telling of the question of was there torture of the detainees in the 1987 Operation Spectrum when the 20 over people were rounded up for involvement in a Marxist conspiracy. And the film, in this case, was not banned, fortunately, compared to Singapore with Love, but it's being restricted to people who are 21 years old and above, right? And what does this do, right? This denies teachers the chance to use that film in the classroom. So during the whole time you are growing up, you are only exposed to that story, right? Of course, if you have time, and Singapore kids don't have time, they don't have time for that, right? They don't read, they do a lot of homework, right? Holidays are for studying for the exams, which happens right after the holidays, not a real holiday. So there is this struggle to tell what is in the past, right? And Singapore, particularly what is difficult is not just the fact that it is there is some amount of difficulty that you will face, but the fact that there is very little information that is out there, right? And we talk about the smart cities, right? Another kind of meme and dream that we have, right? That they will put out open data. But there's very little government data out there, because the default position is when there is data, the reason, before you release it, you should say, why should we release it? Rather than the opposite position, which is, why should we not release it, right? And therefore, the history is overwhelmingly the official history. And this future of ours falls into that. And I think not just the government buys that, but people buy that.
Okay, so what comes to my mind actually is the starting part of the film where you're brought into the city and there's the soundbite of Lee Kuan Yew saying that this place is a swamp, right? And how, people thought it was, impossible to transform this into a city. So I think pretty much the Singapore story is based also on a story of urban development, right? And how that's equated with success. What also was interesting to me when I was there was overhearing two older ladies talking, and we were in this dome where they actually had these models of, multi-leveled sky apartments, right? And they were talking to themselves and they were going, wow, actually, this is going to be the future of your grandchildren. Your grandchildren or like our grandchildren will be living in this, and we won't be able to see this, but our grandchildren will, And so it's that some kind of ring of certainty to it that was interesting to me, Yeah.
So my question is for both Rachel and for Mai. I think both your presentations suggested a certain anxiety, one around ensuring that Singapore has continued relevance, and that particularly the Singapore model has continued relevance, and the other is the ways in which Singapore might not be able to fully lead, if not participate, in the most dynamic parts of technological capitalism. So I'm trying to figure out if that is a particular political opening, or what the politics of that anxiety might entail, or how we think about that anxiety.
Yeah, in thinking about the politics of anxiety, I think that's been hardwired into our entire Singapore consciousness. Because as I mentioned, the doctrine of relevance and sustainability is one that's permeated the very consciousness of the Singapore state, and then it's passed down through the legacy, if you can call it that, of the PAP. And it relates fundamentally to Singapore's status as a small state, because they bring up the other examples of how other small states in other parts of the world have ceased to exist over time, and that for us to continue existing, we have to be relevant or useful to other parts of the world. And then in that so-called relevance, it creates an opportunity or political opening, commercial opening for Singapore companies to go abroad, broadening their corporate networks, that sort of thing. But it also relates to the geopolitical anxiety, as you mentioned.
I think just following the point where Chua Beng Huat brought up about the Singapore government cutting down on internet security, I think there is actually a sign of some sort of insecurities there about the Smart Nation initiative and the possibilities of what information overload or insecurity would bring. What I find interesting is really how the Singaporean state has brought the story of how it's come to be into the story of sustainability expertise, right? Of all its like garden city kind of developments, etc., and now has, said that we were thinking about environmentalism a long time ago with this. So I think it's still always trying to rework its own history, right, as a form of expertise, right?
Thanks for the fantastic presentations. I saw I've seen in Singapore, my very brief time here, a couple of different trajectories in thinking about the state and its these sort of narratives. To follow up on Eugene's question about the politics of representation, and so I was amazed at a visit to the gardens behind the bay, where you have these very wild electronic LED trees lit up. So there's this sort of to me that resonated with these sort of imaginaries of transhumanist, techno futures, or the techno nature, this sort of presentation of nature through technology and design. It's very much a design intervention, but one that is presented to the public in a certain way. And I definitely get the feeling, the way that that it resonates in the way that you have this very individualist emergence of this individualist design subject. But on the other hand, there's another vector in the way that nature is presented in a very, through the experience of the nuclear family, right? So there's this presentation of parks and, wandering through as, like a full family with like several children if you're a good Singaporean. So I wonder how you see these two vectors of the individual as well as the control through the production of the family in a certain way. How do those come together in the contemporary?
Well, you know, Lee Kuan Yew is as the designer, right? And design is political, right? And so is architecture. And in fact, Singapore, the design of Singapore is actually designed for control, right? That's why I say thank God for automatic water faucets, you know, because even up to now, 30 years, 50 years, right? We still have taps where you are forced to either wash or press. And quite often you can't do both at the same time, right? Because what it's saying that we can't trust you to switch on, just use the right amount of water and then to turn it off, right? And imagine if you go to, even up to now, you go to a public swimming pool, the kind of contortions, bodily contortions you got to make in order to shower. Because you press the thing, you can't soak, right? All sorts of imaginary things. And up to now, you can't trust people to say that, hey, you know, I know how to use the water. After all, you have a safe water campaign for 30 years, right? And I would say that even in the architecture of town councils, of the town cities, town centers, right? We have this HDB housing estates, right? Toa Payoh, one of the first, had a town center where people can congregate, right? Before the it was built before the 1970s. But after that, no town council had a natural place where people can congregate, right? And when people congregate, it's dangerous because they start doing things like, you know, getting together, flash mob, start demanding for things. They start to demonstrate, right? And I would say, my guess is that the design of the old campus of the National University of Singapore is based on two quadrangles, right? Where Tan Hwa Piao held his demonstrations, right? And you look at the design of NUS, right? There is no natural place where people can congregate. There is an amphitheater, right? But it's not used for that. People don't use for that. So not that the students will avail themselves of this in the present day Singapore, but I think it's design and architecture by control. And it continues to permeate our lives, that we can't trust you, right? To come together, and that's what I'm saying about Singapore, the future of Singapore. People don't come together to do things, right? And can I add to the point about inclusiveness? You said it's the meme of inclusiveness, right? It's the inclusiveness of certain allowed things, right? How about LGBT? How about dissidents, right? How about people who disagree with you? These are not included in our embrace, right? They are beyond the pale.
I think it's very interesting. Listening to all these discussions, all very negative views, right? But I'm not worried at all because, you see, in Singapore, there's a tendency that people try to sabotage everything. You put up yellow lines in the SDP that you're not supposed to use that. People still use it. Since the colonial period, this is the 5-foot way. Nobody used the 5-foot way. They're still selling things on the street. So it's kind of a mentality of rebellious things. You then gather at, say, pink dot things, right? But still happening. Amoshi, you see one good examples. He just project all this nonsense. So basically, Singaporean is not that stupid, I think. So the government can do whatever they want. Yes, we say yes in order to avoid jails and all these summons. But at the end of the day, I think everybody can have this kind of relative freedom to do whatever they want.
I mean, seriously. No. I mean, it's very serious because I mean, we know each other very well, and I'm really surprised because the way you speak is like we have completely no agency at all. That we basically do what the government says, and you are not, and it's not true of you, and it's not true of me, and we have to assume that it's not just not true of you and me, but of a lot more people. Okay, so I mean, then the other thing is keep repeating this kind of narrative really doesn't help. I mean, I think one should start thinking about how else do we reconstruct ourselves. For example, right, this little island, we exceed this little island a long time ago. There is now necessarily a Singaporean diaspora. This country, this little island cannot contain everybody who is able. A lot of people will move out and move out. right? I mean, the government even concedes that. That's why we have Singapore Days in New York, in Melbourne, and all these places. Not only that, this stuff about relevance and all this stuff, okay? We are no longer able to contain the surplus capital we have. We now have to invest in the world. So we have to stop thinking about ourselves as being capital dependent on foreign investment. We are investing in the world and ripping off other people, right? I mean, Temasek makes $40 billion last year. So, it's one thing for people with, who drop out of Sec 4 to think one way. It's another thing for us to keep repeating the kind of lie that we know is not really happening, okay? And then to actually look at how else do we reconstruct? How do we talk about this society? As a way beyond sort of, creating more paranoia. There's already enough of it. I mean, I'm actually really quite disturbed.
You want to reply?
Post 2011, actually, a lot of the paranoia dissolved, right? 2011 was the election in which we saw the PAP government getting the least percentage of votes ever. And there was liberalization, right? But 2 years later, it is not evident if you do not look for the evidence, right? Maybe I am paranoid, but there are so many additional stories of them penalizing people for exercising their agency, which I admit we all have, right? You can choose to do it and get punished, right? But I want to highlight the difference between a society where being different, being unpleasant to the government, disagreeing with the government, being a dissident, does not come with the cost that it comes to Singapore, okay? To Singaporeans who do that, right? So, for example, in the last 2 years, right, I've documented almost 20 cases, and these are the cases I know, where people who are in civil society or have criticized the government cannot get jobs in the teaching institutions, right? And beyond the story of Charon George and Tay Chun Hang, okay, Tay Chun Hang we're not sure, right? There have been other people who have been told who cannot renew their PR or cannot renew their EP, right? Because they were involved in activities outside of their university as activists, right? And I've also had stories of artists who were teaching part-time in the university and were told in the last 2 years, don't bother coming back, right? Sure, these people still have agency, right? But I think we must see within the whole political framework, is it inclusive? Does it accept that people have the right to do this and not get penalized, right? Or not as much as they are in liberal democracies. So I feel paranoid. Even though we speak to academics, I speak to academics and I say, can you say this? And they say, I'm afraid. Because there are consequences, right? So am I paranoid? Perhaps I am. But maybe these stories are false, but I don't think they are, right? So it is not as if we really don't have any choice. We have a choice, but the choice is stark, is clear, right? And I think it's gotten worse in the last 2 years.
Hi, just picking up on what Professor Widodo just mentioned in his presentation. You were talking about how Singapore government holds hostage the talents of other countries. So it made me think of eugenics. And I think a long time ago, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew famously said that he believes in eugenics, how he would rather have a lot of mainland Chinese come to Singapore so that we get the best of of their traits and talents. So it made me think whether it is still prudent of our government today to hold on to the CMIO quota, and does the panel think that is it still a myopic exercise in the government's attempt to hold on to their power, or do you think we are ready to open up to like other groups of people to come in to Singapore?
I think it's, if you look into the real situations, I think most of our Singapore kids now can understand a bit Tagalog or Javanese, right? Because they spend more time at home with the mates, and the mates keep talking about the Tagalog and Javanese. And as my example, for example, like the so-called the Malay, Indo-Malay things, that Bahasa Indonesia is more cool than Malay. So there is a crack in the so-called the categorizations of Malay, Chinese, Indian, and so on. Of course, the fact that Putonghua Chinese is not the same like Hakka, Hokkien, and Teochews, and the fact that the food here in food court is getting more oily and more salty because of the cooks not from Hokkien or Hainanese anymore. There is some undercurrent shift, actually. And I noticed that the government is not very persistent in pushing into these 4 boxes anymore. There's some, okay, in the policy, in the terms of giving money, in terms of, they still use this, but relating, for example, like Malay should be Islam, right? And Indian should be Hindu, or Chinese should be Buddhist or Taoist. It doesn't relevant anymore. Because the fact is that it's very, very, as I said, it's a very cosmopolitan. Indian can be Christians, can be Catholics, can be Muslims. So this fact is, I think, is being realized, although it's not formulated into the policies yet. But I see that this is a kind of internal kind of evolutions that is going on. Singapore, as my first argument, is always has this kind of DNA, the hybrid DNA, that can, carry forward in whatever form of government, in whatever form of Singapore in the future, that it will stay like that. Because we cannot remove Singapore from the 1 degrees north, right at the cross point of Indian Oceans and the Pacific, because of these positions. And even if the total population changes completely, this island has the DNA to be a success story in the future. Because it can, is destroyed by, I think by the Majapahit, and then destroyed by Ayutthaya, destroyed by Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. There's many things going on here, but still, Singapore persists for 2,000 years. Any pessimistic views that say that we will not survive beyond 2050? Unless the global warmings come up and then the sea water level going up, as what the taxi driver said, okay, only the rich will survive because the ship is ready for them on top of Marina Bay Sands. Maybe after he watched a movie, the China saved the world. But I don't think that is only it's dystopia and utopia, but there's always in between. We are not in very much, yes, we like to dream. We like to be pessimistic and paranoid. But at the end of the day, life will flow as usual.
No, I just want to ask a very light question, since it seems to be, we are getting very serious here, Like, if you are in America, for example, we have the notion of the American dream, right? American individualism and all those things. But since we are talking about Singapore, memes, schemes, and dreams, can you say, is there any Singaporean dream? Is it just the 5 C's and that's it? Or is there any kind of Singaporean dream that can sort of like be that's a part of just talking about the government all the time?
Beng Hua probably has a rejoinder to that, to this. I don't think Singaporeans dream. They don't. Yeah. I said that last year, and I don't think that we have the. I think we do have the imagination, perhaps, but we really don't have the tools, right? We really don't have the knowledge, right? Because dreaming is based on a grasp of reality, right? Then your dream is a meaningful dream, I think, right? And that's why the most interesting science fiction is based on science, right? And that's why magic realism works, right? Because it is an extension of reality, but with dreaming, with magic. Yeah, so I don't doubt that Singapore will survive for another 100 years because we are very good at that, right? If we dream, dream of post-PAP. Yeah. I think Singaporeans, in fact, don't. As last year's election shows, right? When they regain 70% of the vote, right? We don't dream of only 30% dream of a post-PAP. It is so. We dream of a world-class transport system. We dream of a clean and green environment. We dream of these things. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have dreams?
Well, I've never dreamt of the 5 Cs because those have always been like out of my reach financially. Yeah, but in terms of dreams, I think people like in my age group are becoming more concerned about things like inclusivity, like the LGBT rights, and also less censorship in terms of like the kind of media we're allowed to access and the kind of knowledge we are allowed to attain. But the thing is, like, this also raises the question of who is allowed to dream, because I have a friend who does research on civil society organizations in Singapore, and she has found a bunch of organizations that undertake in various ways and at various scales different urban interventions to try to change Singapore society bit by bit. But the thing about that project is that most of the people most if not all of the young people participate in those organizations are middle class, well off, and normally they don't face the kind of pressures that people from lower income classes do. So for me, that is that salient question of who is allowed to dream and who is allowed to like mobilize their dreams.
May?
Actually, I'm just thinking whether one is allowed to dream if one is full of anxieties or, I think I would agree with Rachel in the sense that when I talk to people who are younger than me, they do actually talk about visions and dreams, and I think that's a very optimistic kind of sign. But again, right, like who is allowed to actually carry these dreams out? But I'm also trying to think about the role that imagination and dreams play in a landscape where, everything else is controlled and, what can you do, right, in that sense? Yeah, I'm trying to think about that.
Okay, it's 4:45. Quoting my friend is just to close this way. He always comparing Singapore with a bicycle with 2 wheels. So we keep pedaling. If there is small stone in front of the wheels of the bicycle, it will collapse. If we are slowing down, then somebody else will take over Singapore. We can dream, we always dream, but of course, we have to realize that we are not a car with 4 wheels. So keep pedaling, and that's the only things that make Singapore move forward. If we stop pedaling, then someone else will take over. So I think this is a quite productive, very productive sessions with the obsessions or whether there is some paranoia and optimism. But I think these things that makes us as a Singapore, right? Thank you.